516, Apartheid Part 1. It's 57 minutes, 43 seconds. WGBH TV Boston.
Funding for this special Frontline series is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Tonight on Frontline, turmoil in South Africa. The price for over 300 years of segregation, repression, and white domination. Now, an unprecedented five-part series examines the events, the leaders, and the forces that created this racial crisis.
I've been lenient and patient. Don't push us too far.
From early battles between native Africans and white settlers, through the Boer War and decades of British domination, to the creation of apartheid and the explosion of black rebellion. The whole story of South Africa's long march to the brink on Apartheid.
From the network of public television stations, a presentation of KCTS Seattle, WNET New York, WPBT Miami, WTBS Detroit, and WGBH Boston. This is a special Frontline series with Judy Woodruff.
Apartheid. It means literally apartness in Afrikaans, the language spoken by the descendants of the Dutch, French, and German settlers in South Africa. It has become a word reviled by most of the world, a hateful symbol of racial oppression. In South Africa, apartheid is a system of laws that determines human rights, where people may live and work, if they may vote, all by race. Whites on the top, blacks on the bottom. Apartheid has been the official policy of the government of South Africa since 1948, although white supremacy has been practiced there for centuries. Tonight on Frontline, we begin a five-part series on South Africa, a journey into apartheid, how it developed and why it persists. But first, a traveler's guide. South Africa lies on the other side of the world from us, across the equator at the southernmost tip of Africa. It is about 1/6 the size of the United States, with 31 million people, about 1/8 the population of the U.S. Nearly 3/4 of the people are black. The majority live in impoverished rural reserves like this one, called homelands. The rest must stay by law in ghettos called townships, near the white cities or on white-owned farms. There are several black ethnic groups, the largest being the Zulus. Almost all the 5 million whites live in the cities. South African whites have two distinct cultures and languages, English and Afrikaans. Afrikaans is also the first language of nearly 3 million people of mixed race, so-called colors. And there are also 1 million people of Indian extraction. South Africa's rich supplies of gold, its diamonds and strategic minerals have made it the industrial giant of Africa. For whites, it is a first world country. Johannesburg, the economic and cultural hub, looks like Denver or Houston. But the third world is only 12 miles away in Soweto, the giant township of 1.5 million that is black South Africa's nerve center. Pretoria, the administrative capital, is 40 miles to the north. Parliament meets here in Cape Town, a city much like San Francisco. Durban on the Indian Ocean is Africa's second busiest port. By definition, this series on apartheid is about whites and blacks in South Africa. But it is important to remember that black and brown people built rich cultures in southern Africa hundreds of years before the first whites came in 1652. Tonight, our journey into apartheid begins with the arrival of those first white settlers. This first program was produced by John Blake of England's Granada Television.
When white men first settled on the shores of South Africa more than 300 years ago, they had no idea of the wealth the country had in store for them. They conquered the inhabitants in a series of bloody wars and imposed white rule. Racial domination was common to most colonial enterprises, but in South Africa it became uniquely refined and known as apartheid. Apartheid is a word from Afrikaans, the language of Dutch, French, and German colonists who called themselves Afrikaners. Apartheid means apartness. It was the method by which Afrikaners set out to preserve their own identity and to achieve power over all South Africa's people of any color. Apartheid was the creed of these men, the leaders of the National Party, who formed the first all-Afrikaner government when they were elected to power in 1948.
The central issue of the election undoubtedly was the slogan, apartheid. People didn't know really what it meant, but it certainly meant that the white people would retain their privileges longer than they were likely to do if there wasn't any apartheid.
It was the culmination, the climax of dreams and thoughts and hopes, secret and perhaps not so secret, of all the Afrikaner people which came to realization in 1948.
For Afrikaners today, 1948 was a milestone on the route to the power which they now enjoy. But white privilege, racial superiority, and the exploitation of African labor, the elements of apartheid, were nothing new in South Africa.
In the early stages of construction, the native laborer, always very willing and teachable, played a great part. There were certainly plenty of him. His wages were not excessive, and he didn't belong to any union. But he worked hard from morn till night, and the line gradually assumed shape and form. These native gangs are easy to handle. They respond splendidly to training and soon become expert hands in the arduous work of rail construction. You can see how efficiently they pull together and how thoroughly and wholeheartedly they help progress.
The fact is, white occupation of our fatherland has brought deprivation, dispossession, enslavement, cruelty as probably never experienced anywhere else in the world, where the white man set himself up as something next to God and blacks as almost nothing.
The British took control of the Cape of Good Hope from the Dutch in 1806. Britain sent men and women to settle the borders between the Cape Colony and troublesome African tribes. The armies of the British Empire were more effective than the Afrikaners at defeating the African peoples. But British rule was resented by the Afrikaner farmers, or Boers, as they were called in Dutch, who had settled there many years before. They depended on slaves to work their farms. When the British made slave-owning illegal, 6,000 Boers set off with their families and servants and traveled deep inland to escape British control and to establish independence. They called themselves voortrekkers, the people who trekked out. Their exodus became known as the Great Trek. Ever since, Afrikaners have complained that they were mistreated by the British.
The whole history of the Great Trek was one of dissatisfaction with the way in which the Afrikaner has been treated. Then there was the way in which the blacks were allowed to settle among whites and the problems of a border situation, raids of the blacks in the white areas, thefts, murdering and burning down farms and so on.
Free from the British, the trekkers settled in country which Africans regarded as theirs. One group went to the Zulus to negotiate an agreed sharing of the land. The Zulu king, named Dingaan, decided the best way to keep the land was by force, and had the trekkers murdered. Other Boer trekkers decided to take revenge. One evening in December 1838, 470 of them formed their 60 wagons in a circle, in a well-defended spot next to a river. Generations later, Afrikaners built a national monument on the site. The trekkers pulled their animals inside this laager and waited. The following morning, 10,000 Zulus attacked. Their spears and shields were no match for the Boers' rifles and cannon. Just 3 trekkers were wounded, but 3,000 Zulus lay dead. The Boers called their victory the Battle of Blood River. Each year on December 16th, Afrikaners celebrate the anniversary of that triumph as a holy day.
They called on God to give them the victory on that situation, punishing a person for a treacherous deed. And God did it. It was a matter of punishment.
The 4 trekkers moved slowly deeper into the country. When they found water and fertile soil, they stopped and took as much land as they and their cattle needed.
That huge area of land became your farm. Invariably, there would be black villages in that area, and they would become your servants. They would find that the land of their forefathers suddenly had been taken over by these 4 trekkers.
My great-grandfather settled over there just down, at the edge of that hill. And that was about 1860, early in the 60s. They settled down there. And the farm Doringfontein on which we are standing now is the whole farm on the hills there over till you see the horizon there, and then on this side again on the hills. It is a large farm. And he was the first white owner of this farm. There were not blacks on this area when they entered it.
The evidence that Africans did occupy most of the land hundreds of years earlier is conclusive. This sculpture is one of many early African objects that has been carbon dated. It was made in the 5th century. But South African school children are still taught that the whites arrived first.
There is no single part of South Africa that can be regarded as exclusively white, nor can we accept the fact that there were large parts of this country that were unoccupied. Our people, in the latter part of the 19th century, were pastoralists, agriculturalists, who moved their herds from place to place, who plowed land and allowed to lie fallow if it became worked out. And if you find a man at one corner of his huge field, you cannot say that this field is not yours or this area isn't yours because I didn't find you at that particular corner at that particular time. It is also true, of course, that South Africa is a very big country. When the whites arrived here in 1652, there couldn't have been more than 2 million South African blacks. And therefore, they could not have occupied every inch of South Africa. But this country was theirs.
In the 1840s, the Basotho people occupied these large areas of fertile ground. By the late 1860s, after a series of wars, the Boers and British had squeezed them into a narrow strip of land against a dense range of mountains. The effect was disastrous. Like many other areas into which Africans were driven, The little land they were left had to be massively overcultivated, and the result is now erosion. Rain has washed away the fertile topsoil. A pattern of life was being set. Africans' land, the means of their livelihood, was seized. What was left was insufficient for subsistence, and in order to survive, Africans were forced to work for white men, initially on farms. Diamonds were discovered in 1867, and then gold in 1886. The need for black labor became desperate. To keep costs down and to control the labor force, African workers were herded into compounds. They were forbidden to be in town without a pass. Offenders were harshly punished. The machinery which was to produce apartheid was getting into gear. The diamond and gold fields were the richest in the world. They revolutionized South Africa and brought a clash among whites. British imperialists craved the riches, but the gold was in the hands of the Afrikaners, or Boers, in their independent Republic of the Transvaal. Britain went to war to capture the prize. The Anglo-Boer War was an unequal fight. On the one side, the full might of the British Army, almost 500,000 men, and on the other, guerrilla forces of Afrikaner farmers, outnumbered by 10 to 1. It took 3 years and 70,000 dead before the British forced the Boers to surrender. The British succeeded by burning Boer farms and by herding Boer women and children into concentration camps. Many Afrikaners became Britain's most bitter enemies. They were determined to recover the power to run their own lives in the way they saw fit. The graves of their families are tended still. But most Afrikaners forget the other victims of the war. At least 14,000 Africans died too, in camps and fighting on both sides. What's more, it was Africans who lost the peace. British business needed South Africa to be profitable and peaceful. To reconcile the defeated Afrikaners to empire, Britain in 1910 handed control of the country to English speakers and Afrikaners, by now almost equal in numbers. They called the country the Union of South Africa. Both groups of whites were agreed on what to do with the Africans. They needed their labor. The British colonial government had long taxed Africans' huts. Shortly before Union, they had imposed an extra tax on every African in Zululand. It was designed to be beyond their means, to make them leave their villages and go to work for white men to earn the cash to pay it. When Zulus failed to pay, colonial troops burned their villages and crops. One Zulu chief, Bambata, still refused. He formed a guerrilla army and took his men into the hills in the last armed African revolt. In 1906, colonial troops executed the rebels and cut off Bambata's head. Some African families who lost land by force in the 19th century banded together to buy farms at the turn of the 20th. These Africans were competing with the white man in commercial agriculture. They wanted to avoid having to leave their families and work down in the mines.
They wanted to come here because it was safe for them to work on their own rather than to work for the whites. They wanted to live peacefully not under permission of anyone. After my father bought the land, what he grows in the land is mealies, beans, peppercorn. It was enough to save himself, his family, and what remains he can sell to other people. It was much better than working in Johannesburg because he has no place for his children to live in a proper way. So he thought it would be much better for him to buy his own place where he would live with his family.
Such African enterprise threatened the supply of labor, both for white farmers and for the mines. To stop the spread of commercial African farming and keep the mines going, the government made it illegal for Africans to buy land outside the areas to which white conquest had confined them. These areas were called native reserves. They stamped the shape of 20th century South Africa. Africans were restricted to just 7% of the land, although they were 70% of the population.
The chief enemy of the African people has been and is still today the Land Act of 1913. It caused starvation because the breadwinners would leave the country to provide the big farmers of South Africa with cheap labor.
More and more Africans had to seek work on white farms. In return for 90 days' work a year, they were permitted to live on the farm, but they were paid nothing.
Singaholi imali.
Ukugqoka.
Wawugqokuswa ngabelungu uma usebenza ekhishini, kodwa uma usekhaya wawugqokuswa ngabazali bakho. Wangaholwa lutho. Babahola ukulima, ukufuya izinkomo kuphela. Babangaholi lutho. Akusiba abantu abaphathana kahle. Ngoba bebangasibhadari, abasibhadari. Abathandi ukuthi umuntu abe nento enhle.
When South Africa was given self-government in 1910, Africans could not believe that Britain had washed its hands of them. A group of clergy, teachers, and chiefs sent polite delegations to lobby the South African and British governments, but their petitions were turned away. These black intellectuals formed the ANC, the African National Congress. One of them was Josiah Gumede.
They were not hostile to the British government, but they were accepting that they were subjects of the British government, and that as subjects of the British government, they were entitled to the rights which all British subjects were supposed to enjoy. Western civilization is supposed to be based on truth, honesty, fairness, and justice. It was felt that if your cause was just, then civilized people would see to it that justice was carried out.
Many South Africans still looked to Britain. Black Africans hoped in vain for justice. Some Afrikaner leaders wanted the benefits of empire. But extreme Afrikaners resented the British connection. In 1914, a handful of generals attempted a brief revolt. More than 100 rebels died. Another episode in the catalogue of Afrikaner resentment. South Africa's head of state was still the British king, who sent a governor-general to represent him. The economy served the interests of the British Empire, and British style dominated South African public life. White politics were still consumed by the passion of Boer versus Britain. The needs of Africans were a low priority.
The separation between white and black on the political level and on the human level was so complete, and the lack of interest on the part of the white community of the hopes, the feelings, the sufferings, the aspirations of the black community. They were so far removed from one another that under normal circumstances, the vast majority of your whites, and especially the Afrikaner people, would have had no interest in what was happening and what was living in the hearts of your black community.
Conditions for most Africans were harsh. A black miner had to serve a 9-month contract. Each day took him closer to its end, but only if the work quota was certified by a white miner. If not, then the day's work did not count, and the contract would drag on. In extreme cases, frustration led to violence.
My father had to work underground, drilling holes with a chisel and hammer like this until he gets 4 feet in the rock. And if he didn't fulfill that 4 feet with the chisel and hammer, then he was not paid. He was told by the white miner that he's only paid by porridge in the compound. And this frustrated the black miners so much that some committed suicide by holding the white miner after he was about to blast the holes and then lit the fuse. Then he would hold the white miner, so they must all die there.
Leonard Mdingi had heard this story from his father, but still followed him to the mines. Like every miner, he had to live in a compound, a series of bunkhouses close to the mine shaft.
We were very crowded, 20 to 30 people in one room. It was very cold. I was sleeping on concrete bunks or like that. I had only one blanket. That was the only blanket I had to wrap myself. I felt very uneasy to see so many people in one house.
Segregated from white miners, hundreds of miles from their families, every aspect of their lives was controlled by the compound manager.
We were discouraged to meet women because the compound manager felt that we will get VD. People were practicing homosexuality right inside the rooms, and nobody objected to that. I would say that living in a compound, you find that your whole thinking becomes distorted, and you feel that you more or less think like an animal.
Black miners were paid less than a tenth of a white miner's wage. In 1922, the mine owners, faced with a falling gold price, tried to cut costs by giving Africans jobs previously reserved for whites. To protect their jobs, white miners, mainly Afrikaners, went on strike. Inspired by communists, they called for a revolution against the mine owners and their political figurehead, Prime Minister Jan Smuts. The strikers attacked black workers, and some white communists marched under the slogan, "Workers of the world, fight and unite for a white South Africa." Martial law was imposed by Smuts, who routed the strikers with artillery and bomber aircraft. By siding with the mine owners, Smuts made himself the enemy of poor Afrikaners. His government, whose party had been in power since Union in 1910, fell in 1924. His successors passed many laws to protect white workers from black competition. They called it the civilized labor policy.
You know, if you look at all the legislation that had been passed since Union, then you notice that from both sides, provisions were made reflecting the pattern of life in South Africa, separation in a sense. It was simply a case of legalizing what was conventionally accepted. This wasn't really to deprive the blacks of anything. It really was to regulate their presence amongst the whites.
Along the coast from Durban have risen many pretty seaside resorts with dull-like houses, for the prosperous South Africans have made themselves quite comfortable. We have seen what the white man has achieved for himself in South Africa. What has he done for the native? He has put him to work.
In the 1930s, when South Africans talked about race or racial problems, they did not mean black and white. They meant Afrikaners versus English speakers. So when the leader of the English-speaking party, General Smuts, and the leader of the Afrikaner National Party, General Hertzog, formed a coalition to combat the Depression, commentators were enthusiastic.
The occasion is one of dramatic interest to the whole of South Africa, as it celebrates the uniting of the two powerful parties into a coalition government, thereby cementing the friendship of the two peoples and ending all racial controversy.
The country's real racial controversy was ignored by most white politicians and the newsreels. The subject that most worried them was the plight of some 300,000 white people, mostly Afrikaners, who were living in poverty. More than 20% of the Afrikaner community had sunk to a level thought fit only for a native. They were called poor whites. So the bitterness of Afrikaners was given an extra twist. Not only had English speakers taken control of their country, many of their people were now beggars in a society which expected its beggars to be black.
In the 1932, with the Great Depression and drought, hundreds of rural Afrikaners, farmers and people who were less skilled and unskilled, trekked through to Port Elizabeth, where they hoped to find employment. And I had the opportunity to listen to those tales of woe, of agony, of pain, of despair on the part of many of the people. The Afrikaner politicians came out and were part and parcel of those poor whites who suffered very severely. And it was the plight of many of them and of their fathers and their mothers and their families which spurred them to move into positions of political power eventually. There's no doubt about it. That was, to my mind, one of the strongest incentives towards the political action of the Afrikaner people.
One solution to the poor white problem was to stop poor blacks from climbing the economic ladder. By 1929, more than 100,000 Africans had joined the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, which aimed to get their land back. Such a mass movement was a challenge to white domination. The new Prime Minister, Hertzog, set out to put a stop to it. He got Parliament to abolish the vote that Britain had allowed a few blacks in the 19th century. And he doubled the 90 days Africans had to work for white farmers if they wanted to live outside the reserves. They now had to do 180 days in order to qualify. Africans organized delegations to protest. Edwin Mafutsanyana was one delegate who went to argue with Prime Minister Hertzog.
This is what he said, and why I say he was honest. He said when he walked in Europe, he felt free. But every time he came back to South Africa, he was always worried because one day we shall overwhelm them.
Many Afrikaners thought Herzog was not doing enough. They wanted not just to keep the Africans under their thumb, but to beat the English speakers as well. In 1934, under the leadership of a Calvinist minister, Daniel Malan, a group of these extremists broke away from Herzog's party. They called themselves Purified Nationalists. Behind them lay a secret society, the Broederbond, which had long been sworn to Afrikaner supremacy.
The basic motive was clear, and that is that the Broederbond would have to ensure that the Afrikaners' position would be definitely ensured in every sphere of life, both the political and the economic and the social and the educational and the cultural and the religious. And that is why the Broederbond included every sphere of life of the Afrikaner people and saw to it that every sphere of life was in some way being monitored, directed, and protected. And that remained the pattern of the Broederbond development throughout all these years.
Just about 100 years ago, teams of grunting oxen heaved wagons over bare rocks and scrub, as thousands of Boer farmers, descendants of the original Dutch settlers, left Cape Colony to open up the interior. They called themselves the Voortrekkers. They founded
In 1938, the Broederbond and Malan's Purified Party organized young Afrikaners to reenact the Great Trek. This appealed to their national memory and caught the imagination of the Afrikaner community, especially the young. Malan told them that they were God's chosen race and that their survival was sacred.
Some people, it really meant something religious. Many parties were wedded at the festivities. Children were being baptized. I saw in Johannesburg blind people touching and feeling with their fingers on the whole of the wagon and everything connected with it.
English-speaking South Africans were all feeling rather confident. They had a united party government, which almost all of them supported. Things were going well economically, and I think they didn't really know what this was about. It was a sort of an Afrikaner game being played over there. I don't think it bothered them at the time.
It was a massive movement of an emotional outburst on the part of the Afrikaner people. And later on, I began to realize that that was part, of the long pent-up frustration, sense of inferiority, of isolation, of loneliness, of rejection of the Afrikaner people, which all of a sudden had been given a tremendous boost by the Ossewa Trek.
The Ossewa Trek, or Oxwagon Trek, won over thousands of Afrikaners to Malan's Purified National Party. But Herzog and Smuts underestimated the appeal of this fervor.
Smuts was, after all, an intellectual of international standing, and he thought of himself as a citizen of the world, if not the universe. And he really couldn't interest himself, and he couldn't feel this intense local Afrikaner nationalism which you had here.
Afrikaner nationalism was further whipped up by the outbreak of World War II. Prime Minister Herzog remained at heart a Boer general. He refused to take South Africa into a British war. Smuts won a narrow vote in Parliament to support Britain and took over as Prime Minister. Afrikaners were a majority in the electorate. Some backed Smuts, but many hoped for a German victory.
The general feeling was, and I participated in that the Germans might win the war, and that, with their help, we might get back to an independent South African Republic. I would say that the real reason for this was in the old saying that your enemy's enemy is your friend. It was always said that Germany is never a threat to South Africa. We had much. We had lost our independence as Afrikaners through the British, and they are still, in a certain sense, reigning us.
For the Great Trek celebration a year before the war, the Broederbond organized the Osava Brandwacht, or Oxwagon Guard. It soon became a breeding ground for fascists, a training camp for arsonists, saboteurs, and anti-government agents. It also attacked Jews and blacks.
Eerste opdracht is, sê ons met die band toe wil opblaas vir daai konijntjie wat ons so sleg maak. Sê ek nee, ek wil nie gaan nie. Ek het 'n verskoning gemaak, dink ek. Sê ek voel nie lekker of iets, ek kan nie meer onthou nie. Dit is maar net 'n organisasie om die Afrikaners mooi by mekaar te bring. Maar die idee was om later die regering omver te gooi. Jy verstaan? Dit was die idee. Om later as Hitler kom, jy sien. Want ons het gewag dat Hitler moet kom. Die Ossawaans. Ons het gemeen, Hitler sal kom.
While the Osava Brandwacht, or OB, resorted to sabotage, many blacks continued to support the war effort. The speeches of Prime Minister Smuts made them believe the war could bring them freedom.
Of modern history. This war is a new crusade, a new fight to the death for man's rights and liberties.
It was understood that the fight against Hitler's Nazism was a fight for freedom of peoples, you see. The American President Roosevelt, Churchill, they met in the Atlantic and drew up a charter to unite all the peoples of the world in their nationalities and call upon them, you see. These ideas of freedom spread throughout these countries, you see. And in South Africa, you see, they accelerated the movement of conscious amongst the people, you see.
Again,
Smuts spoke of freedom and democracy abroad, but he told his white electorate at home, of course, everybody in this country is agreed that European and African should live apart, and his government conducted the war accordingly. Black South Africans and their colored comrades who joined up were not allowed to carry firearms. They drove vehicles and some guarded aircraft with spears. 120,000 African and colored troops were sent to risk their lives for freedom, but they were technically non-combatants. Servicemen who were not white were not supposed to fight.
You can't say that we weren't fighters, because when the enemies did come along, they jumped in the ACACs, those who were in the infantry, they up there and so forth. They were shooting, they did everything. And we were fighters, but in actual fact, to the country, we were non-combatant. There was a time in El Alamein, when the battle was rather very strife, very strong at that time. And all the chaps were on positions, and there we were standing at our trucks, and there was no guns. And so the one fella said, officer, can't we also have a gun? So he said, yes, you can have a gun, but providing you don't shoot any of the white people, and the white people would have been there with the enemy. That was very surprising to us, and we got it and we shot just from cream because they were all enemy. Afterwards, he just said, I hope none of you shot any white people. Oh, how do you fight a war? How do you fight a war?
The war opened the door for blacks. The need for weapons and military equipment accelerated the development of manufacturing industry. It brought more Africans than ever into urban areas.
Thousands of Africans had to be allowed to move into those jobs that had originally been done by whites who had moved up north to fight Hitler's war. And it was that industrialization, among others, that led to an upsurge in the movement for a just society.
The changing face of wartime South Africa gave new impetus to black opposition. The old leadership of the ANC, teachers, lawyers, and clergymen were under pressure from a new group, the ANC Youth League. Young men like Nelson Mandela, seen here in one of Johannesburg's segregated townships, were impatient with the organization's 30 years of defeat. The dense concentration of people in the shanty towns, where thousands of the new black industrial workers had to make their homes, opened the way for an effective mass movement. Black miners began to form a trade union. Their hopes had been raised because color bar legislation on the mines had been relaxed during the war to allow blacks to do the jobs of whites away fighting. But when the white soldiers returned, they wanted their old jobs back. This meant black miners were demoted.
I was surprised because I had never been told that the job I had been doing, I had done anything wrong to it. What I expected was that something would be done with me to show that I had proved to be a faithful servant during the time of difficulties. But this wasn't done. Instead, I was demoted and placed on my job without any increment. I felt that now, if people should suffer even when they had done their best under conditions that were trying, that because I am black, I must be neglected. That is why I joined the 1946 strike.
Low wages, dangerous working conditions, and poor rations for African miners had led to a series of strikes and riots after the war. Cash wages had actually fallen by a quarter over 50 years. In 1946, a mass meeting in Johannesburg decided on a strike. Sifuni Mali was their slogan, Zulu for "We want more money."
As we walked down along this road, we were chanting our songs, Sifuni Mali, Sifuni Mali. And we hadn't been far through in that avenue where we were working when we saw lorries loaded with soldiers. And then they started charging us, and then they started hitting us, shamboking us. And then we had to charge the fence that were along the road, on the sides of the road, and we had to charge it and fell it off and then run away. Some of us never got back to their minds. What I felt that was we were being done down because we were black and so forth. I felt I wasn't having a fair treatment with Europeans.
Most white trade unions were strongly opposed to the black cause. Class divisions were race divisions.
We could not reasonably expect the white workers to side with us at a time when the horizontal color bar gave them a privileged way of life, you see, in which they had better and higher standards of living. And they would have a vested interest in such a system. Naturally, as human beings, you see, we can't expect the impossible and miracle in human life, can we? Yes. But our position was not that. We were against the white men because of the white skin. Not at all. We regard the whites, colors, and Indians as human beings like ourselves. The only thing, you see, we wanted to unite against white domination. To overthrow white domination, destroy it, and open the way for a democratic society here in which every human being will be recognized as a human being and have full rights as such a human being, you see. In which the people would work together to build up a new South Africa, you see.
We, the
the peoples of the United Nations. Momentous opening words of the Great Charter for World Peace.
World leaders were now saying they wanted political rights for all peoples. Smuts played a key role in the drafting of the United Nations Constitution, designed to protect the principle of non-racism and universal human rights. But that made no difference to his policies at home. Segregation was South Africa's tradition. Smuts had nothing to offer the blacks, whose expectations he had raised.
Well, his attitude was that there was no complete solution, no once and for all solution to this problem. He felt that the only thing you could do was to extend rights and privileges to the natives in proportion to their capacity, their ability to bear responsibility.
Smuts' approach was not enough for most Afrikaners. Just as they were beginning to struggle free from poverty and the oppression of British rule, they faced a double threat from industrial development. Their farmers were losing black labor to the cities, and in those cities, Afrikaner workers faced black competition for jobs.
We were concerned that with the movement of blacks into the urban areas resulting from the economic integration, what would result from that would be political integration and consequently a threat, to the self-determination of the whites and particularly of the Afrikaner. We saw that if we were going to find a larger and larger number of blacks permanently settled in the white areas, that their legitimate aspirations for political power could be understandable and could not be withstood.
The economy's demand for more African workers threatened to undermine the policy of segregation, and so might have challenged white supremacy. Afrikaners wanted to turn the clock back, and in the election of 1948, their national party came up with a slogan: Apartheid.
It was clear that the National Party under Dr. Malone was not making very much progress, and so they had to, as all parties do, had to look for a cause. And that is how the Apartheid Manifesto came into being. But it would be a mistake to think that the National Party, that's my own point of view, came into power on the basis of apartheid, because at that stage, what became known as apartheid, and was a very strong slogan, an easy slogan rather, was not much different from what was already known and existed under the name of segregation.
The election was to be fought largely on one issue: the future of black-white relations. The United Party, under Smuts, accused the nationalists of being fascist. But the nationalists said that Smuts was soft on blacks.
There was no particular plan which the nationalists could attack, but it was precisely its accusation against the United Party that was too laissez-faire about the whole situation that they came up with what was considered to be a more ordered form of organizing race relations, and that is what apartheid eventually became.
They exploited that fear that we were going to plow them under in a sea of blacks. And of course, the whole idea of calling the black people an enemy, a menace, die swart gevaar, the black peril, was a very, very unwise step. It gained them the election, but it really was sowing the dragon's teeth.
By the time Milan and his National Party came to power in 1948, blacks had long complained of the hardships imposed by segregation. Many of them thought that the nationalists' policy of apartheid was just a change of name. They were to be proved cruelly mistaken.
The transformation of apartheid from an election slogan to a racial policy is the subject of the next program of our 5-part series on South Africa.
After its stunning rise to power in the 1948 election, the white Afrikaner government unleashes the first crushing blows of apartheid. stringent pass laws, inferior black education, and forced relocation.
We don't want to shoot the black man. We would rather govern him.
But black anger grows, and the resistance movement led by Nelson Mandela turns from nonviolence to militancy after 69 blacks are killed at Sharpeville.
We hope you'll join us for the next segment of Apartheid. I'm Judy Woodruff. Good night.
For a transcript of this program, please write to Frontline, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding for this special Frontline series was provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.